Oh. I don't know her first name.
Barbara, isn't it?
Ellerston is her last name.
Yes, she's simple to.
Oh, he's already introducing her.
Right.
Your sound isn't on.
There's no sound.
Like sound.
Is there any sound? Is there any sound?
There is now.
There's still no sound.
That one's muted. Is that the microphone?
Yeah.
Mic should not be muted. You can't hear me?
Now
You can now. We can hear you now.
Mistake.
Now you can? That's very close. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we're fine.
Okay. Well, I was in the midst of you guys missed the beginning. That's all. It was just boilerplate. I was saying I was expressing my gratitude to my co-organizers, John Pollack, curator in the Kislak Center, and Jerry Singerman, humanities editor emeritus at Penn Press. It's always great to work with them, to talk and dine with them each week. And in a minute, I'll turn the organizer's chair over to John, who will introduce this week's speaker. But first, let me introduce this year's Bristol Schoenberg Fellow in the History of Material Text, Priya Nambra, who's working right now. She's a doctoral candidate in the Department of South Asia Studies, and you'll get to hear her speak about her own work in the spring semester, as is traditional for the Bristol Schoenberg Fellow. And until then, you'll be hearing from her each week as she moderates our listserv, and you can sign up to be on that list by putting your email in the chat or on the sign-in sheet that's going around the room, I hope.
Yes.
Yes, it is. If you're not already on the list, you'll just get 1 or 2 emails from us a week. And you'll be hearing us thank Priya each week for all the other work she does to make the seminar possible. So please join me in welcoming her to her new role. And now that the sound is worked out, John, I'll turn it over to you.
Hi, everybody. Hello, Zoom folks. Welcome back. You've heard this, or welcome for the first time. I'll be as brief as I can, but this is always a nice moment. Beginning of the season, exciting, technologically challenging. In fact, seems like our tech takes up more time than our objects, but it's a balance. Part of our welcome is also on behalf of the Penn Libraries and the Kislak Center for Special Collections, Rare Books, and Manuscripts. That's where this seminar is physically, and even for those of you, our friends on Zoom, I think it's worth just underscoring that the physical presence of the seminar, which is devoted after all to materiality, is important from its founding. We have almost always, with a couple of itinerant exceptions, met in a library setting, and we try to confront material objects and connect with each other socially and intellectually. One of the other reasons it's, I think, nice to have this in a library space is it, to the best we can, suggests that our field, our project, our study, whatever we want to call it, crosses disciplinary frontiers. So it's definitely in that spirit of connection and bridge building that we're really excited to kick off our season with Ann Tiballi tonight. One of the bridges that this seminar makes, I think, is that actually will take us back for some of you to the final seminar of last spring, long ago. which was given by Roger Chartier, who is, I think, on Zoom tonight. Hi, Roger. Roger's subject, as some of you will remember, was the Inca craze of 18th century France and a novel by Françoise de Graffigny called The Peruvian Letters. It's an epistolary novel, that is to say, a novel in the form of letters, but most of those letters, the novel tells us, were written on or written as quipus, the knotted cords of the Incas. So in Roger's seminar, we debated this material metaphor and whether Graffigny, the author, could have ever known actual quipus or just the textual accounts of them. So I can proudly say that Roger Chartier and I have actually seen actual quipus, and that is thanks to and under the expert guidance of our speaker tonight, Ann Tiballi, who is by turns curator, steward, interpreter, and general innkeeper for many things, these and many, many other collections at the Penn Museum. Roger and I spent a wonderful afternoon looking at and puzzling over some of these quipus in the Penn Museum collection, and that partnership actually made its way into Roger's presentation. Anne suggested to him a key research discovery that in the latest Paddington film, Paddington's family bracelet is actually a quipu. So we're very up to date. Now, I think a lot of you know Anne, but perhaps not all of you. She's kind of a legendary figure on campus for her indefatigable work at growing the pedagogical presence of the Penn Museum. I have seen her impressive pedagogy in action, and she works with, I don't know, dozens, hundreds, thousands of classes, innumerable classes. And she's also, I think, a formidable cat herder, making connections between many of us on campus who teach with objects. Thanks to Anne, a number of us have begun conversations, cross-campus conversations that will lead to greater sharing of expertise and methods across our collections. Here's a sentence that Anne writes in a very recent issue of the Penn Museum magazine called Expedition. This is Anne. Students who visit the museum for a class or event don't see the administrative complexity that supports our work. What they do see are wonderful objects, questions to be answered, and people who can help them. That's Anne, and I can't imagine a more precise and perfect statement about the goals that we have in doing this kind of work. So besides her role as a master teacher, Anne is also a scholar of the pre-colonial Andes. And I know I'm very, very excited to hear more about her own investigations. Zoomers cannot see the pretty splendid display of textiles on the table. Printed books really look dull, but and maybe we need to go in a different direction here. Zach, let's forget this thing, and this is beautiful. So Anne's master's and doctoral work both focus upon a subject which is linked to that of the quipus, which is to say textiles and their manufacture in the Incan kingdom, particularly by women. Her dissertation, which is from SUNY Binghamton, is entitled Imperial Subjectivities, the Archaeological Materials from the Cemetery of the Sacrificed Women, Pachacamac, Peru. I suspect we'll hear more about that subject tonight and about the challenges of interpreting identity and meaning from archaeological and textual evidences. So I can't imagine a better beginning for our seminar year, and please join me welcoming Anne. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Priya, Zach, everybody else who invited me here today. I'm going to share screen. Make this big. Okay. So I'm tremendously honored to kick off this year's material text seminar. I'm delighted and I'm also confused as I'm an archaeologist who works in a non-writing context. But I spend a lot of my time thinking about how Penn students can connect the objects at the Penn Museum to the concepts and methods that they are learning in their coursework. And I'm very happy to see some of my visiting faculty in the audience today. This also connects to my own interest in how people learn to make and to use ancient material culture. My research interests are decidedly material. I am interested in things. I like stuff, bits and pieces, the physical, tangible, remnants and reflections of ancient cultures. I'm interested in the cloth that they wrapped their babies in, the food that they prepared for feasts, and the urns in which they were buried. These kinds of objects are the means through which I hear them speaking to me, not through their writing. So I'm going to do a bit of learning in public with you tonight and re-examine some of my favorite bits of the past through a new lens, thinking about them not as just material, but as material texts. And so I beg your indulgence and your patience, and I promise I've got some really good pictures. Okay. So archaeologists working in pre- and non-literate contexts have a complicated relationship with writing. We refer to the archaeological record as analogous to the historical record, a material timeline that complements and supplements the written one, though with lots of stains and some missing pages. We talk about interpreting data, making the process of learning to do archaeology one of language acquisition and literacy in a foreign soil-based tongue. It is apparent that texts are important metaphors for archaeologists, mediating between what we think we understand and what we hope to understand, the past. This metaphor comes with some discomfort and criticism too. For some, the written word is a symbol that points to the real thing. Archaeologists have the real thing right here in the ground, so why do we need the word? Unlike writing, which for most of human history was the purview of the elite, archaeology can tell us about regular people and reveals aspects of life that would never have found their way into the record books. This is not to say that texts are corrupt and artifacts are objective, but we are sometimes proud and prickly about our non-textuality, even as we return to linguistic and textual metaphors and allegories to understand how ideas and meaning are communicated between past actors and between the archaeological record and ourselves. Ian Hodder, who was sort of my undergraduate boyfriend, proposed in his 1986 book, Reading the Past, that this assumption has been implicit in archaeology from the beginning, but unacknowledged and under-theorized. For Hodder and other post-processual archaeologists, the goal is to understand how meaning is made through the interrelationships of objects and soil samples, architecture, etc., within an archaeological context. An object cannot be read on its own. It only reveals meaning in its relationship with other meaningful elements. As someone who frequently works with orphaned objects, those that have found their way into museum collections without provenance or provenience, without context or surrounding soil matrix, I bristle a bit at the idea that objects in isolation are mute. I think this ignores the tremendous material voice of the object that exists outside of context. But I also appreciate Hodder's emphasis on looking for the ways in which objects can encompass and communicate a variety of meanings that have been and continue to be interpreted by various social readers. So one of the problems is that so many of our quipu do not have any sort of context. We know they're from Peru, we know when about they're from, but we don't find them in the archaeological record. So this is a picture of a very rare occurrence, finding a quipu in situ at the site of Incahuasi on the coast of Peru. So I would like to take the brief time I have with you this evening to explore some of these thoughts within my particular research context, which is the textile record of the South American Andes from the present day back to some of the earliest examples of woven cloth in the world over about 12,000 years ago. So the Andes is a very complicated place, historically, environmentally, and archaeologically. The Inca, who despite how often they are portrayed in popular culture, controlled the region for only about 100 years before the arrival of the Spanish in 1532. Preceding them was a rich cultural history shifting from temporal horizons dominated by singular ritual or administrative ideology, maybe even a state, and then these intermediate periods of localized control. Andean cultures did not have the wheel. They did not have domesticated animals that would pull a cart or let you ride on them. You can try doing that with a llama, it will not work. They did not have iron, metallurgy. They did have an extremely sophisticated irrigation and agricultural systems. They had complex visual and material culture and a deeply embedded social values that enabled them to survive in one of the most varied and extreme environments in the world. So the vast majority of our knowledge about these cultures comes from the archaeological record, but we owe significant debts to history and to ethnography. The writings of the Spanish and the colonial Peruvians from 1532 onward have provided an important, though complicated, source of information on the Inca, which can sometimes, in some cases, be carried back even further to the pre-Inca periods. Obviously, these texts need to be heavily scrutinized. The first conquistadors presented eyewitness accounts, but they did not understand what they were seeing. While later generations of mestizos and indigenous authors were separated by time from this pre-Spanish past they described. So you got to take it with a grain of salt. And we have some of these volumes on the table here for later. Finally, contemporary Andean populations living mostly in the highlands of Peru and Bolivia are tremendous collaborators in understanding their ancestors in arenas from household organization to agricultural practices, to warfare and ritualized violence, to craft production. Because contemporary Quechua groups speak the language imposed by the Inca in the 15th century, linguistic analysis is also an extremely valuable way into the Andean worldview. So I'll take this moment to say Ayayunchi, which means welcome in Quechua, and everybody say Ayayunchi. And also with you. So let's talk a little bit about Andean weaving technology. And I want to note that one of the reasons that we have looms and textiles going back thousands and thousands of years is because of the unique environmental situation on the south coast of what is now Peru, which is basically one of the driest deserts in the world. So whereas some of my colleagues who work in different parts of the world might end up with a handful of spindle whorls and some loom weights if they're lucky, we have everything soup to nuts, as long as it was deposited in that particular area. So Heather Leckman from MIT has observed that the development of technology in the Andes is not defined by the invention, implementation, and spread of new tools, but by the incorporation of new skills by practitioners and the extensions of communities of practice that share and elaborate on those new skills. For textiles, this means that a loom or a spindle from 1500 BCE looks pretty much the same as one from 1500 CE, even though the yarn and cloth made on them could be radically different. An Andean weaver doesn't use heddles or punch cards to create the complex design and the finished cloth. She relies on fine manual and mental dexterity, on years of practice and experimentation, and on generations of community tradition. The simple tools, let me push play. The simple tools used to assist in this process, so the spindle, the weaving sword, the back strap, and the pick, are in a way extensions of the weaver's own body. They have rhythmic interactions between the weaver, the loom, and the yarn, and they're all together engaged in this act of creation. And you can see she's dealing with many hundreds of warp bouts that are set up with no heddles. Heddles are the things that lift up the yarns that you want to lift up so you can pass the weft through. Complicated heddles and punch cards are what led to in the card loom mechanized weaving in the Industrial Revolution, and then eventually computer punch cards. So we're really talking about a technology that can be extremely externalized, but is here embedded in her fingers and in her brain as she works. There's so much on YouTube. I do recommend just getting a cup of coffee or something stronger and sitting down for some weaving time. It's like slow trains, like train TV. Yeah. Okay. Doesn't like. Okay. Making that finished cloth also relies on a network of farmers and herders to produce the raw fiber, cotton, and camelid wool. Landscapes that contribute all the things needed to make all of those beautiful colors, fellow artisans to consult and assist, and overall a society that supports and appreciates not just the final product, but the process as well. In this way, Andean people living today, and we can reasonably argue also in the past, are extremely fiber literate. They can discern and evaluate not only the surface of the cloth, but the effort, skill, and artistic choice that went into each aspect of it on an individual and on a community level. Darn it. There we go. So this is another Quechua word, payay. It means pattern. So what she was doing as she was picking up those individual yarns is called a payay. So despite my fussing about not having textual resources to understand ancient Andean weaving, we do have a wealth of knowledge that comes to us from colonial documents and from contemporary ethnographic work in Bolivia and Peru. 21st century Andean weavers used textile designs to document local flora and fauna, features of the landscape and human activities that modify and take place within that landscape, like farming, herding, and terrace building and irrigation. They also represent concepts like boundedness and openness, temporal progressions, hierarchies, balance and duality, and reciprocity. On this mantle, you can see a llama, some lizards, condors, and these squiggly diamonds off to the side represent lagoons. You can imagine in an arid environment, lagoons are very important. The divided hexagon, which for some reason I think looks like the Death Star, so I call it the Death Star. Next to the condor is called the Wheel of the Six Fertile Lands and represents the key crops for the Quechua in the highlands: quinoa, corn, kiwicha, potato, and 2 other kinds of grain. Here is another 20th century yikya, which means shoulder cloth. And you can see some of the more modern, or at least less timeless, examples of the flora and fauna of the Peruvian highlands. So in the lowest register that has figurative designs, you see horse-drawn carts and people inside them with piled up sacks of grain. And then on a higher register, you can see a bus, which is the preferred form of transportation in the highlands. Even abstract designs like simple stripes on these food bags might be used to indicate the nature of their contents to a knowing reader, including the quantity and quality based on the quantity as illustrated by the color combinations, the kind of thing in the color combinations, and the quantity and how wide the stripe is. And so households would have a vast stockpile of these bags that they would keep as they needed them in order to sort of label what they were sending out in their storehouses or on their llama caravans here. The same yikyas that transparently display their pumas and running river designs have further symbolic associations in less visible elements, because all yikyas have these plain areas of stripes as well as their buses and llamas. Okay. Here you can see a cloth in process where the author on this Reddit post on Reddit/weaving came across a weaver as they walked through the highlands. They were able to speak with the weaver directly and ask them about the significance of what they were working on. The border of this cloth has an interesting mix of natural and historical icons, which is by no means unusual. You can see that there are, again, the appearance of our lizards and foxes, part of the natural highland landscape, but in the middle, 2 historical elements, Amaru's head and Amaru's execution. And that's the name of those payay. So I'd like to follow up on these middle 2 just a little bit. One of the most arresting designs in the modern Quechua textile lexicon is called Tupac Amaru II, after the 18th century indigenous leader who led a large Andean rebellion against Spanish colonial rule. He took the name of the last emperor of the Neo-Inca state, who lived 200 years before him. Like his ancestor, Tupac Amaru II was executed by the Spanish. After watching his wife, son, and other family members put to death in the Central Plaza in Cusco, his tongue was cut out and his limbs were tied to 4 horses to quarter his body, and then his head was cut off. Though Peru would not gain independence from Spain for another 50 years or so, Tupac Amaru's rebellion and death elevated him to an almost mythical status and remains a symbol of Andean identity and resistance. So if you can parse within the sort of grid-like structure of that warp-faced textile on the left, you can see a man tied by ropes to 4 horses. Okay. We only see this design showing up in the early 20th century. So a significant amount of time after Tupac Amaru II's actual death. Though it remembers an event from 150 years earlier, a series of rebellions in the Andean highlands in the 10s and 20s at this time helped to popularize and disseminate this figure, not only in textiles, but on political posters and other media. And while the horses and the figures are obviously historical, there were no horses in the Andes before the Spanish brought them there. The configuration of this design echoes earlier patterns where space is quartered evenly around a central shape, representing the capital at Cusco and the 4 quarters of Tawantinsuyu, the Inca Empire. Instead of horses, in some instances, you might see condors or other animals, or these sort of sun designs that you see there that represent the sun god Inti, or just plain geometric forms. And it's echoed again in the coat of arms of the Inca Empire created by Martin de Murua in the early 17th century here. So the Amaru head design has a similar history, but jumped between media in the 1960s, when it became the icon of General Juan Velasco Alvarado, who promised extensive agrarian reform and to return the land to indigenous people. This movement caught the attention of reformers around the world, including Afeni Shakur, a member of the Black Panthers, who changed her baby son's name to Tupac Amaru Shakur in 1972. Even though Velasco's movement came to an end at the end of the 1970s, Amaru's head and a quartered body still appear in Quechua textiles today, not as a commemoration of a specific event or a movement, but as a mythic character that exists alongside other characters in the Andean cosmos, whose time is long past, but also still present. Each time the Tupac Amaru design, either one, is woven into a new cloth, and as that cloth circulates and is viewed, the social memory of the uprisings, both historic and recent, is reinforced. Continuing search for justice and representation and a return to the Andean order is expressed through yarn. So now I'm going to hop from the 1970s to the 1470s, before the Spanish conquest, to the Inca period, which is my own personal temporal home with quipu. So quipu are perhaps the best known Andean textile technology, though they are often not thought of as textiles. Partially this is because of who studies them and what their own background is. So a lot of people who study quipu are coming from math and computer science backgrounds, because that's really the kind of expertise that we hope that we need in order to figure out what they say. For those who weren't able to attend Roger's paper on enlightened quipus in the 18th century literature, I'll provide a very brief explanation to what quipus are all about. So this is a knotted cord record keeping system that was used to administer the Inca Empire. So there are sort of close antecedents of quipu before the Inca. They're really just sort of knots on cords or different colored cords being wrapped around things to perhaps indicate meaning. But in terms of scale and intensity, they're nowhere near what the Inca managed to do. Part of the reason that the Inca needed to do this is because over successive generations of emperors, they had conquered basically the western half of South America, and they needed to administer over 80 different cultural groups. They needed to send messages along 35,000 kilometers of land. They needed to mobilize troops and potatoes and fish for the Inca's dinner. All of these reasons, they needed to keep a good record-keeping system. And this is in the absence of a writing system. This is a numeric system. So quipu are written in base 10, which is lovely because we use base 10. So it's really easy for us to read the knots. Here's an Inca chasqui. So this was a young man who would be sent with the quipu rolled up in his hand. And you can see that the Spanish right above that from Guamampomo's illustration says carta. Okay. And this is how messages were transmitted. So quipus are in base 10, and the ones are a little bit special kind of knots, but then above that, each of these registers for the tens, hundreds, thousands, 10,000s, and on up are simply a succession of overhand knots for however much you want to indicate. So this first chord here has 1 in the 1,000 spots, 2 knots in the hundreds, 3 knots in the tens, and a special 2 knot or a long knot, which means it means 1,232. So I do a quipu session for Tim's class. I do lots of quipu sessions for all sorts of Penn classes. I do quipu sessions for 6th graders. And they get this right away because they're working on units, right? They're working on base 10 value. It doesn't work out perfectly when you're actually trying to deal with a knotted chord. Not all of the knots line up exactly right, but you can see they're basically in these solid registers, right? So we have no trouble at all reading the number that's written in one of these chords. Even the long knots are relatively self-explanatory, even though they're harder to execute. The 9 knot at the end has 9 bumps. So they're very rational. Now we can read the knots, but we don't know what they mean. So we think that the meaning, the signified portion of the quipu system is indicated through the other sorts of material elements of the piece of the object. So a lot of these elements are binary. This is why the computer science people are sicking their teeth on this. One binary is fiber. We don't have to mess around with hemp and flax and sheep and yaks and that kind of nonsense. In the Andes, there's basically the wool that you get from camelids and the cotton that grows and was domesticated on the coast. So that's a binary. Another binary is your cord twisted counterclockwise or clockwise? And there are no other options. It's either S or Z based on the middle part of those 2 letters. You can also tie knots in 2 different directions if you've never thought about that. You have S knots and Z knots. And then finally, the way that you attach those pendant chords to the primary chords can be recto or verso, which just means forward or back. These are all binary things. Then there's some open sets. They're non-binary elements of quipu. So one is how a quipu's chords, pendant chords, are clustered, how they're spatially organized across the primary chord. You can see on that particular quipu, there's some very clear clumps, and then there's gaps in between. What does that mean? There's also a very wide range of colors, as you can see from these 20th century textiles here. All of those colors are represented going far back into the archaeological record. So Inca and their predecessors knew how to dye cloth. And they have no lack of colors, as well as color combinations and various configurations that they could employ to carry different meaning. And then finally, even without the sort of spatial clumping and gaps, the way that chords are attached to the primary chord might tell us something about the order in which they were read, the order in which they were recorded, whether or not a subsequent chord is a modifier to a previous chord, etc. And so that's all about seriation. So as I said earlier, part of the problem of the quipu problem is that of the sort of 1,300 or so quipu that exist in the world, the vast majority of them are held by museums with absolutely no archaeological context, right? We don't know where they're from. We don't know what was found with them. And that's the important part. So even after maybe nearly 200 years of archaeological research in Peru, as well as about 200 years of looting in Peru, people are still excavating at sites that are turning up quipu. So this particular site, Incahuasi, is right on the coast. You can see the Pacific Ocean in the background. You can also see how dry it is, right? And why these things preserve. And this was an administrative sort of outpost that was built by the Inca. We can tell from their architecture. And it was primarily storehouses and places for soldiers or administrators to stay while they were in this area. And they found 34 quipu in these various rooms, alongside with the plant remains of some of the products that might have been stored with them. So we know that we've got chili peppers, and we have peanuts, and we have black beans. And for the past 10 years, they've been trying to figure out what elements of those quipus means chili peppers and peanuts and beans. So quipu studies is an immense field within Andean archaeology. On the other side, from the computer scientists and mathematicians, there are people who are approaching it linguistically. There are people who are thinking about the structures and grammatical relationships with inside Quechua that might tell us something about the grammatical structures of the chords. Sabine Hyland at the University of St. Andrews has recently found a quipu that has human hair in it, which might be on purpose. We get a lot of human hair in textiles, but it's mostly accidental. Purposefully placed human hair that might indicate a signature. We'll never be able to decipher them to the degree of Antonio Banderas and Paddington Paddington in Peru. But I would point out, I sent this to John and Roger, that this sort of 17th and 18th century attempt to decode the quipu, which thought of it as these are syllables. If we can just figure out what blue 2 knots means, it means the p, and then we can translate into Quechua. It's just whack. It's completely untenable, but it makes for great storytelling. So I don't mind it that much. One thing that I want to emphasize is that even though it's tempting to think about quipu as numbers and a graphical representation of the kind of business accounting 101 that you might get over in, the Inca equivalent of the Wharton Business School. They were also viewed as sacred objects, right? In terms of literacy, only a handful of local government-trained administrators at high levels would be able to understand and read or make quipu. And then after the Spanish came and destroyed a lot of quipu because they knew that they were important, it's part of their strategy, you get the continuation of quipu in contemporary communities in a different kind of way. So in highland communities now, quipu are not used to keep track of anything, but they're more treated like sacred objects themselves. So on the left in Rapaz, you have the Kahawahi, or the house of the quipu, where a community quipu that's been tended and added to for generations. You can see a little bit on the bottom, these little gourds where the quipu has been offered some chicha corn beer frequently. And people have tied little worry dolls and other sorts of offerings into the quipu. This has acquired a sort of mythical status as well. And then in other communities, like Tupicchoca over here, this is a magistrate. So on important feast days, an important election day, important other, the first day of the harvest, people who have political and social importance in the community will take out quipu and wear them across their bodies as almost like a bandolera of state, But they don't read them in the way that we're trying to use computers to read quipu. Okay. So there is really good but tricky evidence for an expanded understanding of what quipu did in the Inca Empire beyond the sort of administrative function of how many potatoes are in your storehouse, how many people live in that valley. We know from oral histories that were later recorded by the Spanish that the Inca and the peoples around them and before them relied on memorization to record narratives. That's how they got their work done without writing. They also memorized lineages and important events and land use and the ritual calendar. The very first act of the creator god Viracocha was to order his servants to memorize the names of all the people in his creation in order to bring them into being. But note that drawing and sculpting in this quote precede the spoken act of creation. So was the utterance or the icon the jumpstarting of the world? So even as the administrative, legal, and religious structures imposed by the Spanish relied on the written word to exact control over the native Andean populations, they were able to maintain a parallel oral and visual world that was distinctly Andean. And they could share myths and stories outside the hearing of the priest or the patron and wear hand-woven clothing that reminded them of who they were and where they had come from. And here's another example from the Inca period, the royal tunic. So this is probably the most spectacular Inca textile in a publicly accessible collection. It's on Dumbarton Oaks. It's called the Royal Inca Tunic. It is about 100 wefts per centimeter, making it one of the lightest and tightest weaves that we know of from this period. It's a man's tunic, so you can sort of see the slit at the top where you'd stick your head in. And there were 2 armholes to stick your arms out there. And this is basically how they did cloth, because if you put this much time and effort into creating something, you were not going to cut it. So there was no tailoring. More impressive than the weave, though, is the fact that it's covered in these small geometric units called tokapu. So like quipu, the meaning of the tokapu design continues to perplex and frustrate Andeanists. We are heavily reliant on a few extant bits of material culture, like the royal tunic, to help us decipher what they symbolize and why and how they were deployed. So there's a general agreement that the tokapu in the media they appear on were restricted to the very highest echelons of Inca society. This is a picture of the Inca emperor himself in the middle there, wearing a tokapu tunic, and he's surrounded by all of his advisors. They appear on objects associated with ceremony, like textiles and carows, which were used to exchange corn beer, sort of as an opening volley of any sort of embassage. We also have representations of tokapu and illustrations from the early colonial period like these. So these are some of the illustrations that we have up here as well for after. So interestingly, this colonial painting in the Lima school of Doña Beatriz Coya. Coya means queen. She was married to Loyola as a reward because he killed her uncle, the original Tupac Amaru, in 1782. But if you look closely at her dress, her aksu, and her shawl, you can see tokapu designs along the bottom. And then in the back upper left-hand corner, which spatially is the quadrant assigned by the Inca and the current Andean people to the most important people, are her family going back to pre-Spanish times, here in the presence and wearing their finest garments to witness her wedding. So people really, really want tokapu to be a writing system. They're arranged in rows, which is seductive, right? They have consistency across media. They're geometric. They're easily sort of visually grasped from far away. Well-intentioned people who want to confer on the Inca and on the Andes the status of having a writing system will argue that the tokapu or quipu are writing. More recent work, though, has focused on how the tokapu are deployed, what material and conceptual associations exist between tokapu and the things that are important to contemporary Andean people, and that may have been important to the Inca as well. So let's look at some of these individual tokapu on the Inca royal tunic. Now, the most easy to sort of pick out, particularly in large settings like this, is this icon here. So do you see little examples of this checkerboard with the red yoke, right? All over this tunic. So Guamampoma and other illustrators tell us that this checkerboard with the red yoke is the Inca military tunic. Okay. We have pictures of generals who are leading armies, not against the Spanish, but against people that the Inca are conquering who are wearing this tunic. And you can imagine, just like the big red horsehair helmets employed in the classical world, this would be really easy to see your general on a field of battle if you were wearing this, right? Now, when you dig in closer to a lot of the tokapu, you can make arguments for other associations. So sometimes these are agricultural. Gail Silverman and these are all taken directly from the tunic, associates various of these signs with different concepts related to agriculture. So this one's pretty obvious. It looks like furrows, right? It looks like the ridges that are created when you're preparing for planting in the spring. We also have various depictions of kinds of fields, of the stone terraces that are endemic in the highlands for making vertical landscapes into horizontal ones. And then finally, really important are butterflies and pollinators. And the butterfly appears on a lot of Inca visual culture that is associated with other sorts of crops that were raised. There are also tukapu that speak to sort of the administrative and ruling function of the Inca emperor. So the House of the Chosen Women, the Akyawasi, the people that I study, the women that I study. Strangely, the association here is not looking down on sort of a cellular architecture, which is often associated with the Akya, but these particular T-shapes are used to depict vaginas going back thousands of years. And so there might be some sort of dual semiotic weight behind that. We have the military tunic. This is the Temple of Viracocha, the creator god, an Inca provincial center. And as the Inca expanded, they built hundreds and hundreds of these across the landscape to dominate it. And then finally, the Ushnu, which is the Inca's throne, which, as you can imagine, is a step pyramid here. And then finally, we might have the association of certain of these tukapu with some of the groups that the Inca conquered. So this is a little bit more tenuous, I think, but Chinchaysuyu, which is the land that surrounds Cusco and where the Inca emerged, and also was where Guamancoma, this illustrator, was from, is associated with this sort of upside down U shape. And you can see that the leader of Chinchaysuyu has the upside down V or U at the top of his headdress. And then another part, Koyasuyu, is associated with the step pyramids because it's a very mountainous region, and that's also how they built their where they buried their ancestors in above ground stone structures. He's also conveniently wearing it on his belt. So Guamancoma is not the only one to connect Tukapu with the four parts of the empire. In a 1598 inventory of the royal storehouses, a tunic sent to Philip II by Viceroy Francisco de Toledo 25 years earlier is described as a native tunic that they call kumbi, woven of diverse colors and motifs, emblematic of the provinces that the Inca possessed and by which they were known. Unfortunately, the person who was doing that inventory went on to say that it's horribly moth-eaten and not worth anything. And so we don't have that anymore, but we have the text. So if this is the case, are these four Tokapu emblems of the four Suyus that make up the Inca Empire, with potentially hundreds more representing individual communities? Are the other icons of agricultural and architectural concepts like thrones and storehouses and furrows in the field also as deeply rooted in sort of cross pre-Inca associations as these? Despite writing nearly 1,200 pages in his letter to the king and explaining basically everything else under the Inca sun, Guamancoma never gives us an explicit code for understanding either Kipu or Tokapu, though he does show that both communicate without words. So even though there's significant variety and variation in the Tokapu, they are, as Adorno says, repetitious enough to be significant and consistent enough to be meaningful. Now, across these three media, which are really, really only skimming the surface of the kind of temporal, cultural, and technological depth of what we could talk about with Andean textiles. I mean, I've already drank the Kool-Aid, but I'm trying to spread it around. I think that they present a really interesting challenge to the way that archaeologists who worked in non-textual environments, to people who work in textual environments but are not archaeologists, and even to archaeologists who have texts at their beck and call, for thinking about how we think about relationship between materiality and text, particularly in situations where we have so little to go on. So firstly, I want to point out that I am lucky to be working in this part of the world where we have this preservation. And something I always ask people to consider is all the rest of the world where it rains, where all of this sort of lexical wealth would have been destroyed by various bacterial and mechanical processes over the many hundreds of years since they were made. And how paltry, though still satisfying for some people, but not me, the harder remains in the archaeological record are. You sort of have to consider the presence of the absence of fiber perishables when you're thinking about how past cultures communicated. I also think that there's something very intimate and logical about cloth as a way to communicate ideas around identity and practice and wealth and skill. We, as I said, we wrap our babies in cloth, we wrap our dead in cloth before they go into the ground. And all of the times in between, we're using cloth to tell the people around us something about ourselves. In particular, though, which is just amazing luck, I think that the Andes really pushed the idea of fiber literacy to its maximum. Not only do we see it in the archaeological record, but we see it in the ethnographic record as well. And we can pretty much confidently state that even if we don't understand precisely what people were communicating, we know that they knew what they were communicating, and that they could rely on the people that they encountered, even if they were outside of their original cultural groups, to at least feel the importance of these emblems and these colors and these forms. Now, the reason I get prickly sometimes about efforts to characterize these objects as texts is because, and I might need to get over this, but I want them to be more than texts, right? They're not writing. These are not linguistic representations. We haven't talked about any sort of mouth sounds in any of this. These are visual and they're tactile. And we know that the people who were observing them understood not only what they were seeing, but all of the work that went in to create this piece of material culture. So that's actually why I shouldn't be confused about why I was invited. I'm very happy to be here because these are most certainly material texts, and they're good to think about, and they're also good to touch. And so I want to make sure that everybody gets a chance to come up here and touch a little bit. Now, as a final note, because I didn't quite know how to work it into the body of my paper, there's like an obvious pun between text and textile, right? Has everybody been thinking that? I think about it a lot. And they obviously share the same root. I've never taken Proto-Indo-European, but I would not be surprised. But which came first? So with apologies to any historical linguists in the room, text is a written account that comes from the Latin textus, right? Texere, which in turn comes from the Proto-Indo-European meaning to weave or to fabricate or to make. A text is that which is woven. Both terms also relate to a very early word that via Greek brings us the term for technology, with its implications of technique and embodied craftsmanship and skilled making. So I like to think about these texts not as written utterances, but as fully embodied making in the world and making of the world. All right, that's it.
The table.
All right, I'm gonna X out.
Your Zoomers
There you
there.
go.
And thank you for that fascinating and provocative talk. Prepare your questions, but Liliana will get the first one.
Thank you so much for the presentation. It seems to me that what is common in your example is fiber. And from then on, we separate. There are different techniques of knotting, of weaving. There are different ways of using it, of reading it, and so on and so forth. Maybe colors are also something that they have in common. But there's also something I would like you to consider talking about the embodiment of the images and so on. But it is really actual items that have to be worn, that are carried on the human body, maybe not necessarily on the body to which they then are destined. Maybe not everybody can wear it, but the relationship to the human body separates it from the book, except there may be a tradition of the book that comes close to the body as well. So my question is, does your talk give us a lead to think about, let's call it the traditional books, simply because they're traditional for us, not for you, to think about them in different ways by stressing the relationship of the human body? I mean, we have people here who are researching about fingers in the book and so on, but about wearing books in some ways, making them human in themselves in that way.
I like that in many of the contemporary ethnographies, they talk a lot about, the authors talk a lot about how textiles are inalienable from the person who makes them. And you cannot acquire these items through purchase. Somebody has to make them for you. A woman would, before she gets married, amass a large number of beautiful cloths that she might wear throughout her married life, but mostly will be buried with her, or perhaps given away but never sold. The same is true in Oaxaca with the beautiful embroideries and woven huipils. They're very, they're very, very personal. But for this context, at least, the emphasis seems to be on the making rather than on the wearing. When you are wearing something, people know about you, not about what you're able to consume or what kind of purchase power you have, but how well you can weave, or somebody who cares about you, how well they can weave, and therefore what your family status is. So I'd be interested in learning more about the people who wear books, because I get the feeling that as a status symbol in the early modern period, books are much more about what you can lay hands on, what you can purchase, and what you can mobilize from the centers where book culture started than household economies of books. Maybe that's not the case. That's very cool. But I think that the intimacy and the inalienability of textile sort of smashes together the sign and the signified in a very interesting way. And I don't want to mischaracterize books, but it's hard for me to think about those books. I don't know. I don't know.
Jared?
Thank you for this wonderful talk, and I'm thinking about something, and I actually don't know how to frame it. When we think about the text, the written word, the characters themselves in literate cultures can look very different. What strikes me in the examples you gave, not of the quipu, but of the very modern Tupac weaving or the Inca tunics, is that there's an overriding aesthetic, and the aesthetic is very geometrical. And I mean, to our eyes, they're very beautiful, but there's this carryover, which may be accidental, between the pre-contact and the modern weaving, the cross piece, and I'm just, again, I don't know how to frame this, but I'm thinking about how a certain aesthetic seems to be built into the way that meaning is communicated in the weavings, which is very different from the way textuality works, right? Which is not aesthetic driven. I say not a question, more an observation, but welcome your thoughts about that. That it's a kind of geometrical visual literacy that we're seeing in what you're showing us.
Yeah. I've heard from the young people recently that if you change your font to Comic Sans, it reduces the sort of writer's block freeze.
Yeah, okay, right.
Printed with a blank white paper in Word. And I was thinking about, well, are these different fonts maybe, so that the message is the same, but or the utterance is the same, but the way that it's presented can affect how it feels. Because we know, I mean, anybody who's fussed with a PowerPoint and plays with different fonts finds something that they think fits what they're going for, right? There's a certain geometry to weaving that you just materially can't get away from. You have a vertical element and a horizontal element, and you're basically working on a grid. The finest weavers at the largest scales can start to manipulate that. That's how we can get crazy floral designs on like grandma's couch, which is done on jacquard looms, which have hundreds and hundreds of different petals that can lift up. But this is operating on a more, a tighter geometric level. We also see this kind of geometry crossing media. So wall murals at some of these big ceremonial sites will have big friezes that have the diagonal and the sort of jaggedy birds that look like they're made out of triangles. They don't need to, they're painting. But they're copying what was considered to probably be the most important form of media, which had this grid. One thing that we don't see a lot in the Andes is embroidery. Or at least embroidery that's not just like a little stitch here, stitch there. Except for one period, which was really good at it. And the textiles that they produce 2,000 years ago with embroidery are some of the most painterly in the whole stretch. But at some point, and that was also before they'd figured out this, they'd figured out how to do wonderful woven cloth. And once the technology, which is the skill, not the apparatus, advanced to the point where they were able to make pumas and condors and rivers, they abandoned embroidery and painted. They don't paint textiles either after a certain point. So I think that there is an aesthetic that adheres across long periods of time, and that it is a highly valued aesthetic, and it has associations with skill, and that embroidery is cheating for some reason.
Interesting. Let's go to Zoom.
Peter has a question.
Peter Stallybrass and Annie Jones, hello.
Hi. Thanks for a wonderful talk, Anne. That was really fabulous. I wanted to ask about the sort of drive this teleology that everyone is getting towards literacy, the sort of desire for everything to have an explanation about literacy, as opposed to, for instance, about numeracy. In other words, there are lots of things when you look at the quipu, you could think about lots of things, but the sort of desire to make it have a literate meaning, literally what Roger was talking about, for instance, all of these 18th century novels, that the quipus are literally like bits of the novel. They're telling stories, they're telling elaborate stories. And Ray Shearer and Heather Wolf and I are working on what now looks like three guys who are paid more than literate people to do accounting in a dots and dashes notation, which looks remarkably like quipus. It's literally what they do it is in rows, but it's they do it with counters. So it's done basically as a, so it's all done with counters. And none of these three people can write their name. They can't sign their name, but they actually have to sign off on the accounts with an X just to show that they've been doing the counting. I mean, that's the crucial thing. So they're paid more than literate people. And one of them, the main guy we're working on, is a tailor. So he's also all the time working with cloth. He actually has to mark up cloth when he has to use chalk. In other words, he can't really hold a quill very well. Even his crosses are very badly done. So he obviously isn't comfortable with a quill, but he must have been comfortable with chalk to work with chalk. He was actually tailor for Edward VI, so he's the royal tailor, and he's employing people under him. So he has to be surrounded by literate people like this later. So I'm just wondering, what it gives us an insight into anyway is towards why we sort of are constantly wanting to make everything be about literacy rather than an incredibly complicated world of numeracy, often bound up with things like astrology, often bound up, I mean, going back to the Sumerians, vast cultures that actually have to do astrology, astronomy, calendars above all, the incredible difficulty of organizing calendars, which is very much part, as I understand it, of the world that you're studying. So that's really the question.
Yeah, I don't know, because I don't feel that way. But I'm interested in how preparing this talk has maybe confronted. Priya and I worked together last year on ancient mathematics and mathematical thinking. And my parents are both mathematicians. So I tried to get away from it, and then I found myself right back in it, because weaving in particular is so mathematical.
Yeah.
If you think to that Inca royal tunic with those perfect squares that were measured across the entire width of that fabric without shortchanging anybody. Have you ever seen a poster maybe on Locust Walk with the students? They're like, come Friday, and then at the end it's all compressed because they didn't lay out their spatial kerning in order to accommodate what they wanted to say. And I do see examples like that. You can sort of sometimes tell they started at this end and they did this so many repeats of this design, and then they had to truncate it a little bit at this end, right? But never on the best stuff. And these repeated designs are made in sort of combinations, almost like a syncopation of ones and twos and ones and threes, so that you can let certain of the yarns float over the other ones and create a design. These are not flat things. These are three-dimensional things. They have depth. And all of that mathematical prowess is in the hands and in the brain. And that's why I wasn't able to talk about it, but there are some really good ethnographies about how you're able to judge someone based on their clothes, right? Because if you look at, oh gosh, she executed this particular payai with 100 warp bouts. And by looking at it, you can see, even if you're not up close, so I could see how wide that particular design is. It doesn't alter the design at all, but it alters the complexity of the math that has to go into it. And you think that is a good, observant, skilled woman who is paying attention. I would like her to marry my son. And this is what
I'm sorry, Anne, you
Yeah.
misunderstood. I was thinking that your work was mathematical. That was what I was trying to
Oh,
make
it's
it.
incredibly mathematical, but
Exactly.
it's
But I was
not
trying to make-
textual, right?
Exactly. But I was trying to make the contrast in that
It's
sense.
the rest of us that fall into the
Exactly.
literacy trap.
And that's what I was thinking, is that the
Yeah, I
contrast.
also think that more people are numerate than are literate. And if you have
Absolutely.
a robust oral tradition, maybe you don't need it so much. But if you're administering an empire, you sort of need the numbers.
And I think Peter's work recently is designed to bring out some of this in Renaissance European culture that sort of is always there, just perhaps not attended to.
Edward VI, that's really late.
Edward VI?
Is it one of the tailors of Edward VI?
Oh, I don't know who is it? When 17th century?
Mid-16th.
It's the mid
Oh, that's-
16th
yeah,
century,
Tudor,
1550s.
Later.
So he's very well paid. As I say, he's paid more
Yeah.
than the clerk, who actually is above him in rank. He's a yeoman. He's the yeoman of the revels. So he's actually
Yeah.
paid more than the person who's above him because he has all these skills. But the one skill he doesn't have is literacy. So the people are paid less who have the literary skills. So it shows that they valuing him more. That's all.
And maybe a question for Anne out of that, Peter, could be, do we know, does anyone know if the most skilled weaver is the one who's brought to court? Is it women or men? Is there some clear connection between what you were just saying in terms of skill set
Yeah.
and social status?
Well, the most skilled weavers, it's natural talent plus time,
Yeah.
right? And so the Inca harnessed that by creating workshops where they gathered children, male and female, and brought them to workshops where they would be trained. And then they could spend the rest of their life weaving or learning how to tie quipu and read them. So these were careers that were heavily invested in by the state in order to make them happen because they were so valued. That Inca royal tunic, the Inca himself would have worn that. And you know, lesser tunics would have been given away and carried his essence to the person that they were given to. So they were extremely porous and laden with importance.
Very cool. You promised me.
Zach?
On the other side of what Peter's saying, that the royal tunic, and I forget the word for the symbol.
Tokapu.
Tokapu. I mean, the weaving creates that a certain grid, you know,
Yeah.
bitmap style
Yeah.
aesthetic, and the individual squares that are very invested in symmetry. But the tunic as a whole is very non-symmetrical, and so it seems like these are combinatorial elements. It's not that it's alphabetic or phonetic like the
Right.
Europeans seem to want to make it in the 18th century, but they're elements that are combinatorial, and the fact that they're laid out in at first glance like a seemingly it could be random, it's clearly not. But in other words, there's no discernible like weaving's based on periodicity and repeating pattern. That's not evident in the layout. So one would assume that they're being used, arranged in a particular order for setting out a purpose. You said we don't know what it is, right?
No,
But that is a kind of textuality, right? That
Right.
these are you know, movable and recombinable elements that can presumably on two different tunics you're finding. You showed us some that are
you
other-
read them or you suggested scholars.
Well,
have
you
read
suggested
them.
this
People
means suggest a symbol for individual ones, but clearly since they're recurring in different
Right.
ways, the layout must have some.
Yeah.
Well, so this is where
meaning as well.
the manufacture and paying attention to the really nitty gritty is important. Andrew Hamilton, who's currently in Chicago, spent a year at Dunbar and Oaks looking at that tunic. He sees it in his dreams. And he found that, like most Inca tunics, it's actually two pieces, two whole cloths that are sewn up the middle, and that it was made by two weavers. Because even though they could have like a 2x2 square that shows the same picture, they're doing it in different ways. And that also he can tell it used to be significantly more blue and the blue has faded, but by adding that blue back in, he can see all of these little technical choices that each of the weavers made at different points and made slightly differently. The overall effect is very consistent. But it does beg the question, was this meant to dazzle a looker, somebody who's observing it and just see like, oh my God, the Inca is everything. He's furrows and he is military and he is the storehouses and he is the sun? Or was it meant to be parsed in a really particular kind of way? In the same way that somebody walking around with a book, an illiterate person can't read the book, but they know this person is important, they have a book. Or somebody, holding a quipu, that they're important. So it has a weight that might not be decipherable, but still is smacks you in the face.
Yeah,
I wonder if there's some, lost, something we don't have. That would be
the Rosetta Stone?
Sort of pattern.
Yeah,
No,
the
not
Rosetta-
translating them, but to do that between two people, who's telling who and how,
Yeah.
what goes on one and what goes on the other, and where's the join going to be? Is there a pattern?
Yeah.
That's
We don't
some
have
other
cartoons.
material?
we don't have those kind of references. What we have are these long sticks that have cord wrapped around them that tell you how to set up your loom before you do all the little tiny finger weaving. But you know, you need 7 reds and then 5 whites in order to make this design. And we know that those 2 probably women who were sitting at adjacent looms working on both half that tunic was probably at the same time. It was a community, maybe of 2, maybe of 4. It was a community of practice that created this tunic. It's not one person doing successive panels.
Whitney, and then back to Jerry.
Yeah, thanks. This is really interesting. In this conversation about numeracy and literacy and language as recombinatory, but it isn't really, right, is interesting. And I was fascinated by the fact that the big tunic is encompassed in a square in the royal tunic. It's also kind of geometric relationship that you don't get with language. So there's things that exceed language, even as like Europeans are mocking combinatory, like the recombining of text as a model for language in the 18th century. So it was like like with the Legato Academy and John Swift and like the machine to just produce language. Anyways, there's a lot there, but that's not what my question was. I actually wanted to take us to the quipus and them being used as sacred objects, because my like every time I've taught quipus or just introduced them to students, there's like videos online and they always say the quipu is like a spreadsheet, right? Like ink in Excel. Right. Right. And the people who are coming at it from like a coding, you know, computing perspective and being nature of it and all this. But then like we don't worship Excel spreadsheets, right? And
That's what side of campus you're on.
yeah, so I mean, but that was kind of what I was thinking, like we do and we don't. So is there something, like I just wanted to hear more about that practice, because there seems to be something really rich about like technology and culture in the fact that these things that seem to be documenting like records, like their account books, become something that you can attach a worry doll to, or like the wearing of it by an official strikes me as like I can kind of wrap my head around that, but the leaving of offerings at it is hard for me to wrap my head around personally. So I'm just curious for more information.
It is contemporary colonial Inca and back further have the landscape is animated and activated with all of these little shrines and big shrines called wakas. And it was very appropriate to leave offerings at shrines in that kind of way. So it's part and parcel of the sort of religious practice of the Highlands. What's interesting about it is that rather than a spring or a statue or a rock that looks cool, it's a quipu in this instance. And what happened to turn it from an administrator into an object of veneration? There's probably a lot of steps in between, which is some of the stuff that Sabine Highland is looking at. She has found these wonderful things called quipu boards, which are wooden colonial document. They're wooden boards that have paper pasted on them with little Excel file rows, a roster of all the people who live in that parish. And then there's a hole drilled next to the name and a little string. And the string may be different material or color or combinations, and it has knots tied into it. And when you showed up for church on Sunday, you took your string and you pulled it forward. And that's how they knew if you hadn't gone to church, and they could come and beat you because of that. But back to literacy too, I don't know that people recognize their names. It's a really beautiful Spanish Iberian script, but they knew that that chord meant them. Yeah. And they went and they pulled it. So there's sort of the consistency, the continuation of this association with fiber is important. It's administrative. It has ritual weight. And then eventually across many generations, that sort of just morphs into this is an idol like the other idols that we include in our ritual calendar.
I mean, I love that example. You told us that one before, and it's an interesting example of non-destruction by the colonizers or reuse of a,
right,
rather than complete extirpation of a technology. And so it's interesting for that reason. I mean, I guess there are some examples. I mean, Roget's work on Jack Haid, you know, where the parchment is, you know, the symbol of authority and then destroyed by rioters in 13th century England and other places. You know, I guess we could find some analogies there where the administrative tool is also ideologically and even even or symbolically powerful, I guess. And sounds like
I mean,
it's
think about all the people who get to keep the pen that the law is signed with.
yes, that's right. Yeah, our own, yeah. Tim, sorry, and then Jerry.
Oh, thank you for this. It was really interesting. I mean, I've seen some of it in my class, but always love to see these again. Right, I guess it's maybe more of a series of related comments, but I'd be interested in your reaction or anyone else's reaction. It's that I wonder if there's a possibility there's still a textuality to these objects, but that the approach to deciphering them syllabically is just completely wrong-headed. So it's the Kipu, particularly the numerosity of it, is very similar to what we see with the precursors to Sumerian, that we see the numerals developing really quickly, but in relation to ceramic crafts, that technology gets adapted into developing numerals, and then from there we jump to words. But there's not a single example in history of writing developing independently as syllabic. It's always logographic. Phonographic writing only ever comes about later as an extension of logographic principles. So that example of the chord representing a person, or if there is some sort of semiotic meaning to the topkapu, would all be sort of approaching logograms, but there's no indication or even a need for syllabic or phonographic writing. I don't know if that's something that's hiding in the research somewhere, but like, it doesn't, there's no reason that we would expect them to be writing that.
Well, there's a good question, which is what would have happened if the Spanish hadn't showed up? And I don't know, I'd be interested to know if there are other situations like this one where it feels like you're on the cusp. For people who study the very, very beginnings of writing, does this feel like they're on the cusp of maybe developing something later? Or is it just something that is either obviated by a really robust oral and visual tradition, and it might not have happened?
I mean, it reminds me that there's some recent work on the early alphabet, which is called that some of the characters originate in textile patterns, and before they become letters, they transform into glyptic. So you can just, I'm going to stamp this textile pattern. Now that represents maybe me or shit. We don't really know. But that's the sort of precursor technology to it then maybe get some sort of logographic assignment, and then from there it becomes phonographic. Although it's interesting there is that once we go full writing, all of the characters that were based on textiles disappear.
I mean, I feel like if Simon Martin we would hear, he might warn us to be careful of pigeonholing culture. You know, everybody thought Mayan writing was logographic forever, but it isn't. And that was like one of the great mistakes that the Mayan has made for a zillion generations. All these cultures were always on the cusp of something. It's not a way of answering Tim's question at all, but what's the limits, if you know, of the sort of fiber literacy of the Incas geographically? I mean, how far does this methodology extend, and does it bump into other American systems of writing, or really are we talking about isolated kind of places?
To my knowledge, South America did not have any other form of a system for numeracy comparable to the Kipu, or any form of written language. If you know about those beautifully complex mathematical Shipibo and Kanibo Amazonian pots, that is a visual language, almost fractal-like, that is without par in that continent. But I would say that the stretch of Inca visual culture near the stretch of the empire. So you're up in Ecuador, near Quito. You're over a little bit over the mountains into the jungles on the other side, so down into Bolivia. The Peru had a lot of jungle too. And then up into Argentina and down a little bit into Chile. But again, this is another thing, like if the Spanish hadn't come and the empire had kept on growing, would they have come across cultures where that sort of smash would have created something new? Quipu are found everywhere where the conditions are correct for them to be preserved, which is not in Ecuador. It's not in the jungles. Sort of circumstantially, we don't find them up in the very highest peaks of the Southern Highlands where we have a lot of human sacrifice. So quipu are not an appropriate object to include in a human sacrifice. So we don't get them. So we find quipu in the south coast of Peru, where thankfully the Inca had a very long stretch of presence, multiple generations. And we have to extrapolate from this limited body everything that we know about them. I mean, I don't want to denigrate the computer scientists and the people with the Excel spreadsheets, because I don't know how you deal with such granular data in any other way. You certainly can't just absorb it and work through it yourself. You need technological help, in the same way that artificial intelligence helped us find over 200 Nazca lines that had faded so much into the landscape. And now we have new Nazca lines. But I don't know.
Okay, Jerry, a final
Yeah,
question?
no, one bunch of questions actually, I mean, born from ignorance and dilettantishness. So, you've spoken about the Incas really only being in power for a century. And are you talking specifically about Inca artifacts, and is there holdover from the earlier peoples, the earlier empires? The Inca Empire, is it unilingual or multilingual? Are these artifacts, as we learned from the Mayans, there was not a Mayan empire, but there was a kind of common visual culture and architectural culture. So are these artifacts that cross language barriers and carry meaning with them? My final question is am I correct or am I totally wrong that the Incas also made feather garments? And is the semiology of the feathered garments the same or similar to the semiology, if you will, of woven garments? Or are feathered garments or feathered textiles, in your mind, we can't really create their mind, is like a totally different creature that you wouldn't even connect those feathered garments to the woven garments? And
I'll start at the end.
Yeah.
So tremendous feather work. Most of it comes from parrots from the Amazon. So they're being brought in from a long ways away. And you're thinking about like those bright blue and yellow macaws, and red sometimes too, green. So they're not the same colors that we see in textiles. The Inca really, really liked red, black, and white. They liked high contrast with a little bit of gold in there. The people who came before them had different favorite colors, which we can see in the textiles of their archaeological record. The Inca were absolutely an empire, even if we are not very well served by comparing them to like the Roman Empire. They were an expansionist state. They had administrative control. They exacted taxes in the form of labor tribute. They did a census. Ipus helped with that. They imposed their religion and their language, but they did not necessarily force everybody to stop doing their own thing. So in contexts that are sort of just after conquest, or they're a little bit further away and able to do what they want without Cusco watching, you do see more mixing or side-by-side local and Inca imperial objects. But if you get into the right kind of context, you see the shift that Inca is dominating. So those Chusky runners would have been wearing Inca clothes. Those high altitude sacrifices up in the highest peaks of the Andes were all Inca artifacts and clothing. If you came under the purview of the state and they were controlling the situation, you were going to be branded in the state's cloth and other object you know, swag. What other part of that? Think of. I lost the beginning of it, I think. But
Feathers.
feathers.
Yes.
So the feathers defy the ability to create the kind of fine designs that you see on some of these textiles. So it's not really replicating the same sort of iconography. It's not replicating the same colors. With very few exceptions, it's not the same kind of garments. It's like you get a headdress and a fan, or you get a wrap, you know, out of textiles versus feathers. You also see feathers more closely associated with the suyu that's from the Amazon. And so it was an ethnic indicator as well, that people maintain their sort of feathery habits to mark them as being not Inca. But there is beautiful feather work, and the Inca were very, very good. They were acquisitive, right? So when they conquered people that had their own kinds of social status or material status, they're like, let's not get rid of this. Let's figure out how to work with this. And they say, let's control production around this particular resource. Let's figure out how we can use this to bolster our own position. Because there was a lot of soft diplomacy too. It wasn't all maces and slings. And so they were very savvy like that. And I think feather work has a long tradition, but they understood the power of that particular material form, in addition to their special Inca stuff.
Is it cloth?
What?
Feather, is the feather work cloth?
The feathers are tied onto these strings, and then the strings are tacked onto the cloth in layers like shingles. And so they move differently, and they're only really good for certain kinds of garments, but they're tremendous. The Inca are also a sort of disjunct point from the people that came before them because they really didn't like representational iconography. You don't see people very often on their ceramics or on their cloth. They really liked geometrics. But if you go back earlier, some of these other pieces of cloth are tremendously visually narrative, similar to the wall paintings and the ceramics. The Inca were sort of more visually uptight, which I find appealing, but they were not as sort of narratively flamboyant as the people before them. Yeah.
We're gonna get a last question in from Annie and Peter.
It's a question from me, and it's kind of going back to the Inca tunic, which I'm obsessed by, and I'm happy it's come up so often. It seems to me that if you want to talk about the semiotics of the tunic, what it's basically saying is that I, wearing this, am a composite of all the skill and all the design that my people are capable of. So that this is not a kind of textual statement so much as a sort of a kind of semiotic bodily statement, which is, this is I, the Inca, the composite of all the capabilities of my dyers and weavers, and assemblage of this object. So it's a kind of statement. It's very powerful, but I don't think it's like the quipu. It's almost at the other end of the quipu, because it's all at once. It's all happening at once, and it's happening visually, not even symbolically, just corporeally and visually. So I think that's a different form of meaning, and very powerful. And it's interesting that Lilian, you began with this issue of what does wearing this thing mean. So it's a different meaning system. I think it has simultaneity in it.
Yeah, we have a small disservice in not being able to wear these things in collections. You know, we see them flat. They're very flat objects. They're very rectangular. Or we see a picture and they're not animated. There's nobody inside them moving. There's nobody who's wearing them being carried on a litter that is plastered with gold, you know, and you just see them off in the distance coming to your town, potentially to take your children to become kipukamayaks or something. It was absolutely meant to dazzle. And I think that part of the effect of dazzling is that you can't concentrate on a singular element for very long because your eye, it moves too much. And sometimes when you see some of these very elaborate pieces of featherwork or cloth or metalwork or et cetera, that is the effect that it has. You could tell.
Well, you have opened so many doors for us here that
One question.
Okay.
Sorry, one brand new and very final question from,
From William Ellertson, who asks, are there examples of motifs present, for example, in the imperial tunic and objects from pre-Incan culture, and any sense of motif forward migration?
Yes, I think so. So one of the most famous is sort of the meander. And I think it is pretty safe to say that it represents water. And concerns about water go back very, very far in Indian history. They figured out irrigation very early because they needed to. And representing water not only tells you that this is an important part of our world, but it also potentially has an animating force. It's like we weave water so that the water comes back after the dry season. So I think if anything, it's going to be a meander design that represents water. Thousands of years. Yeah. So let's see if we can find water.
there we go. So Anna brought some things for us to look at. Thank you again. Thanks all for coming online in person. See you soon. See you next week. Sophie Rosenfeld from the Department of History will join us.
Can you tell us?
Yes, give us a tiny tour here.
Yes, they're not very old. So come up and handle and